It is about, it's thinking about the ethics of teaching and the ethics of assessment. And as a researcher, I'm really interested in the rhetoric around teaching and the reality, what actually happens. Not just what happens with the best, most skilled teachers, but what happens with teachers who are okay, what happens with teachers who have busy, stressful lives outside school, what's doable for them, and making sure that actually we set teachers up to succeed. Because if we do that, we also will be setting up children to succeed. I'm very aware, and it picks up possibly on the sorts of issues that Ali and Wendy was talking about. Curriculum for Excellence gives great flexibility. But with that flexibility, inevitably comes the teacher's worldview of what we're doing. And we need to ensure that the flexibility that Curriculum for Excellence affords is actually meeting the needs of the children and isn't being artificially skewed by teachers' views. Now, we know that teachers' views are not only formed by their training, by what's written down in the curriculum. Teachers' views are influenced by the media, they're influenced by the resources they get to use, they're influenced by the planning frameworks in schools, they're influenced by a whole range of things. Now, literacy, I'm going to just talk about literacy. Literacy is a social practice. It's not just a set of decontextualised psychological skills. We learn to do literacy, and depending on the family you come from, depending on the community you come from, you learn to do literacy in different ways. You learn to think as a reader in different ways. As you read stories, as you read books, that idea that reading is a habit of mind, which my colleague Viv Smith talks about a lot, you actually learn different habits of mind depending on how books, how stories are actually used in your family, in your community, and in your school. We learn, some people learn, to use stories to make sense of their world. Some people learn to use stories to think playfully and imaginatively. Some people learn to use stories because it's a performance about how good a reader you are, and the whole thing is about getting it right. And we know from the research that middle-class children tend to learn to use stories to think imaginatively, to think playfully, to think in a relaxed way. And they get on in school because they bring all that to their schooling. Working class and poor children, children from low literacy backgrounds, not only bring less experience of literacy to school, they bring different habits of mind around reading. And what that means is that working class and poor children are very, very dependent on the sort of experiences they get in school and in their nurseries to actually lock in to some of these ideas that reading is about relating to the world. It's about making sense of the world. It's about thinking about yourself. It's about thinking playfully and imaginatively. So if their only access to that is through the school curriculum, we need to look really, really hard at the kinds of reading experiences children are getting. That's the reality. Not the rhetoric about the kind of experiences they ought to get, but the reality of what they really are getting. And I'm going to show you probably the politician's worst nightmare. David Cameron went to a school and the best readers in the school were picked to read to him. And this was the photograph that went out. And what's really interesting about that is the narrative of the little girl about what happened. She was reading to what was then the Prime Minister. She was picked because she was one of the best readers in her school. She was reading the text and she could see a word coming up. She knew it wasn't a phonically regular word and she didn't remember what it was. She had no way of working out what that word was. And she just, and I have to say actually David Cameron was really good with her. Made her feel not bad about it at all. But that child is experiencing a curriculum where you can either do it or you can't. Reading is either right or it's wrong. She has been taught no strategies apart from phonics to work out what that word might be. All right? She's been taught with a text like this. And let's just think about the sorts of habits of mind that this sort of text engenders. It's a phonically regular text, which, for those of you who don't know, it means that every single word has a one-to-one correspondence with the phonemes. Bob is a bug. Bob Bug has a mum. His mum is big. Bob has a dad. His dad is fit. Bob has a cup. His cup has a lid. Bob has a cot. His cot has a rug. Mum, Dad, a big bad rat. Bob Bug has a hug. Now, that's there because the habit of mind that you're developing is not just that every word is phonically decodable. Every word you must work out, and you can work out. But it's also developing a habit of mind that actually readers live only in the moment of the words that they are reading. Because actually, that story is so surreal that there is no point in remembering the early ideas in the story because they don't help you. Knowing that Bob Bug has a mum doesn't help you with his cup has a lid, or even that his cot has a rug. What's that about? All right. So, if you're from a low literacy background, and if you go to school and that is your experience of reading, where is it that we are teaching children that reading is about play, it's about imagination? Even if you look through the examples from Education Scotland about play, the examples of literacy are all about examples about how they learn their phonics. Compare it to the sort of habit of mind that other reading books develop. All right, this is Oxford Reading Tree. It was Kipper's birthday. Kipper wanted a party. Everyone wanted to come. Biff put up balloons. Mum made a cake. Dad took a sandwich. And the picture shows Dad taking a sandwich with one hand and very sloppily filling up the washing machine with soap suds, soap powder with the other. Stop it, said Mum. Everyone came to the party. Dad wanted to play a game, but Kipper put the television on. Oh no, said Mum, and the picture shows that the washing machine has completely overflowed and the whole kitchen is full of soap suds. What a mess. The children played with the bubbles. What a good party, everyone said. Now, the habits of mind that that's developing are that it's worth remembering it was Kipper's birthday, because actually, the next thing, Kipper wanted it's going to be party or present or something like that, and you can use your phonics to work that out. But the whole thing follows. It makes a coherent story. It's a story that you can relate to. How many people here can think of times when they, as parents, wanted kids to do things and kids had other ideas? It also teaches you to notice the incidental details in stories that might turn out to be important and to remember them. So the habit of mind that that's teaching is about you need to remember what you've just read because it's going to help you with what's coming up. It's teaching you that even if you don't know a word, you can actually use the context and all the information there to work words out. And it's teaching you to relate stories to your life, and it's teaching them to relate to actually notice the incidental details. Completely different habits of mind. And I was slightly worried when you said that some of the teachers had written in comments that the national assessment was no good because it used sounds that hadn't been taught. Because that is that sort of thinking. Now, we need to think about that, because for me, that's an ethical issue. It's to do with the sorts of materials that are available, because England is such a big marketplace. That is the sort of text that is being sold to schools. There are not enough schools in Scotland to make it worthwhile publishers developing that sort of text. Now that the market has been flooded completely in England with that sort of text, these publishers are moving up to Scotland. but think about the habits of mind that the different sorts of texts develop. That's the first point. Second point is to do with how we use data. So that's just the assumptions of that. SNSA data are just numbers. They don't become information until we bring a professional perspective onto that and make them information. So if SNS data is being misused, we need to think about, well, what are the professional perspectives we're bringing and how are we bringing it? And I think there is space for very, very much more clarity in Scotland about the way that we use data and the sorts of assumptions and information, the way that we can turn data into information. So here I've got a starter question for 10. One of the meanings that we bestow on data is that it has a predictive capacity. So if a child does well when they are 6, we use that data to assume that they're able, and we put them into a top group. If a child does poorly, we put them into some sort of catch-up group often. And that's how data is being used right across Scotland at the moment in loads of local authorities. So, with the person next to you, you have 1 minute. What percentage, now this is based on English data because Scotland hasn't got any data, but in England, what percentage of children whose test score at 6 years roughly predicts their test score at 10? When we take those test scores at 10, what percentage of children roughly do about the same when they're 13 in terms of their ranking in the class? And when they're 13, what about 15? Off you go. Oh, and yeah. And your bonus question is, what percentage of children actually hit all 4 data points as expected to do? You've got 2 minutes just to talk to the person next to you and answer that question, those questions. Right, okay. Right. Percentage of children whose test score at 6 to 7 roughly predicts their score at 10. And although this is English data, some of the tests that they used were the tests that a great many number of local authorities in Scotland are using now, and using in quite predictive ways. How many people think it's 80%? More than 80? Put your hand up. Let's just have a little show of hands. You don't have to be hand right up. Just go like this. 60? 55%. So 45% of children will either overshoot or undershoot at the next data point. When we look at the percentage, the predictive capacity of the tests for 10-year-old, 45% of children concur. 55% of children are going to either overshoot or undershoot. It gets even worse when we get to 13 to 6, to the difference between a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old, 33%. And across all 4 tests, only 9% of children actually follow the predicted pathway. 91% are either going to overshoot or undershoot at any one point. Now, that matters. It matters in terms of ethics because, A, it's evidenced. Becky Allen, who produced this work, is an educational economist. And at that point, she was working for the Education Data Lab. It really matters that across Scotland, local authorities are using some of these tests to set, to stream, to group children. It's not the tests themselves, it's the interpretation and the professional assumptions we make around those assessments. Now, this is an opportunity for Scotland to do it differently, to actually radically rethink how we do assessment. We have a curriculum for excellence that gives us freedom to design a curriculum mix to work for children. We need to make sure that actually we use that curriculum mix really, really well, not to label children as able or less able, but to make sure that the range of experiences we're giving kids is ones that meet their needs. If we have that sort of text, and that's the sort of text that children meet in schools, almost exclusively in some classrooms, and children then get to the bit of the snazzer that says, listen to this story and answer some questions about it, and a whole cohort of children can't do that. That is an opportunity for the school management to actually step in and say, let's look at whether or not we've got the curriculum balance right. Are we reading enough stories to these kids? If we get some children who do well on the story listening but poor on the story reading comprehension, that's a diagnostic thing in telling the teacher where they can intervene, what sorts of experiences children need. Not to put them into a top group or a bottom group, but to actually think analytically and in an evidenced way about whether or not we're giving the right sort of mix. An inexperienced child is not a child who has low ability or low capacity. An inexperienced child is just someone who needs a much richer experience of what literacy is like. I would love much better models of how literacy and numeracy, all the benchmarks of literacy and numeracy, fit into a play-based curriculum, because I don't think they're there at the moment. If we stop talking about high ability and low ability, and I've heard people in this group talk about it, and we spoke of experienced and inexperienced instead, what would happen and how would that shape our thinking about how we use data, how we get a profession to use data really, really well, not to label, but to make sure we're actually giving children the education they deserve. That's it.